Alrighty lads, we are back. This time with a very interesting proposition. Would the Slivers survive Warhammer Fantasy? Now you see, you may not know anything about this, but I actually used to be a huge Magic the Gathering player back in 2013, 2012. But then after that I kind of lost my touch because they started adding a bunch of stuff that I just kind of lost my touch with. But I was usually a Goblin player, a blue deck player. Yeah, that's right. I'm one of the guys who would give your deck diarrhea. That was me. No creature cards whatsoever. Just kept making you just draw until you had no cards, and then boom, I won. I was one of those pieces of shit. And I also liked Slivers. Slivers were a very unique deck because I once had a Sliver deck that literally was nothing but creatures. No like magic cards whatsoever. It's probably a really crap deck, to be honest, but it was really cool when I started to get the ball rolling. So that becomes the question. Could a species like the Sliver, if they got the ball rolling, could they survive Warhammer Fantasy, or would they just destroy it entirely? We're going to dive into that. So, before we even get started, please comment down below, like, subscribe. I want you guys to comment to me and tell me how your week is going. I want to know, are you happy this week because I posted something, or are you just more curious about other things that I'm doing at this moment? Like right now I'm working on the Legacy of Kain World of Nosgoth dice roll RPG. Let me know down below. So back to the topic. Slivers, what are they? So Slivers, when you look at them, they're actually a rapidly reproducing species of a variety of types. Now, this is where it gets very interesting. They spawn with one head, a snake-like body, one arm, and sometimes they have two tails, sometimes it's one. It's a little inconsistent sometimes. But the one arm and the one head is very interesting. Now, when a Sliver is born, it's essentially a 1-1 counter, which means that it's roughly equivalent to just a normal human. 1-1 is also equivalent of a goblin. It's the equivalent of a lot of things. 1-1, that's what that stands for. So we have basically a normal, goblinish, humanoid type creature. I'll let you choose whether or not it should be goblin strength or human strength, but in the end it really shouldn't matter because of what's going to come next. As the Sliver matures and grows up, depending on the environment it's in, it can pick up certain traits and mutations. A Sliver is very susceptible to the magics around it and the very environment it is dwelling in. So, this becomes a very interesting proposition. If it is very susceptible to environments and things that it's around, what happens to it? Well, as you may have seen on the video, I've had tons of Slivers on display. There are some Slivers made of pure magma. There are some Slivers where they live in the forest for so long that they start to become bigger and more monstrous than the other Slivers. This is very interesting for a lot of reasons, because then that means that they can grow and mutate in any way, shape, or form that they may need to. Now, what's interesting about this is that whenever a Sliver does mutate, it's not all the time, but when they do, what happens? When a Sliver mutates, like let's say it grows wings because it's in an area that's got a lot of mountains, so it grows wings so it could fly from mountaintop to mountaintop. Well, when that Sliver returns to the hive, the entire hive gains wings. The entire hive gains that trait. Now, the only way to get rid of the trait is to kill the Sliver that created it. That is what is making the Slivers so powerful. This is why if you have a Sliver deck, it is always best to attack with your tokens and not attack with the actual creatures that have those buffs, because you don't want to lose those buffs. And it can actually get pretty crazy and really insane, some of the shit that Slivers have. Like in Magic the Gathering, there was this thing called, I believe it was called Fog or it was called Cloud, one of the two. But essentially what that meant is that anytime a creature would attack this creature, it would actually do no damage because it's a mist, it's a fog. Well, there is a Sliver that could have that, where he emits a fog around him. Now you have just an army of Slivers that are emitting this giant fog. It just looks like a cloud. And your guys know that there's enemies inside that fog, but they're just whacking away blindly. They can't see what the hell they're hitting, so they're just doing no damage. The only way to really hurt them is to use magic. And then there are some slivers that are actually immune to magic. And then guess what? They get with the hive. Now the entire hive is immune to magic. It's like, oh man. Once they get the ball rolling, it is particularly nasty. This is why a lot of people hated slivers, by the way. Anytime I whipped out my sliver deck, people got pissed. And they were like, oh, you're a fucking troll. You just want to see me get pissed, blah, blah, blah. You're a trash player, blah, blah. They're right. But that's not the point. The point is that slivers are fucking amazing. I love them so, so much. Now, slivers do come in different forms. I did say how they were born with one head, one arm, and then they have the little tail, and they look like a snake. But there is some slivers, and thankfully they didn't last long, but they're called the Shadowlore slivers, and they look like humanoids, basically. I'm not going to talk about them very much, but you may see some artwork of them. Yes, those are slivers. Yes, they do give the same sliver buffs. They just have a different form. They still function the exact same. So just ignore the ape-like looking slivers. But when it comes to slivers in Warhammer, this is where I would say they could survive in two fashions. So let's look at scenario 1. What if we drop them off just in the middle of Warhammer Fantasy as it is today? So you have dwarves losing most of their holds, Skaven are everywhere, orcs and goblins are everywhere, Nehekara is just Tomb Kings, vampires are everywhere, humanity's barely holding on. Like, what if we just drop them into this scenario? What would happen? Well, I think what would happen most realistically is that slivers, they tend to dwell down below. And I think what would happen is that when they spawn or they get dropped into this world, more than likely they're going to be discovered by one of three species. Dwarves, who would probably ignore them because, hey, if they're not hostile to them, they really don't give a shit. They'll just ignore them. Then you got the night goblins, and the night goblins might try to eat them, and this would prompt a bit of a fight. And then you have Skaven, who may enslave them, experiment on them, or eat them. So there's a little bit more variety with the Skaven than there is the night goblins. Now, this could spiral out of control in a lot of ways. I do believe that if the slivers were just dropped into the Warhammer universe, the first sliver spawns, the sliver eggs are starting to hatch, I do think that a race would subjugate them very, very fast. The question becomes, what would happen to the slivers from their enslavement? And this we thankfully can look at Magic the Gathering, because they actually do have a few realms. They call them planes, I call them realms. But they do have a few planes of existence where slivers were used as beasts of burden. They were used as carriers, messengers. They were used as like a lot of things that you would use modern day animals. And they would be very useful for their mutability. Now, think about that. If they can mutate in a wide variety of ways, and they're captured by a bunch of night goblins who tend to grow mushrooms, what if we have mushroom slivers? Slivers that become the most potent of venom because they are with a spider goblin, and the spiders start to mutate the slivers, so now slivers are producing webs, they're producing venom. Or what about the night goblins, where the sliver now has crazy magical capabilities because the mushroom that it's mutated from is a mushroom that's incredibly magically potent? What would happen then? Well, I think the night goblins would be very interested in subjugating these species and including them in their rituals, their day-to-day brews, their day-to-day rituals, their day-to-day fiascos. And I think it would be very interesting to watch, because now the night goblins' economy would boom. The spider goblins' economy would boom, as now they have more resources at their disposal. Now, whether they would treat the slivers with respect is, well, debatable. Some goblins, they do tend to take care of their stock, and they tend to be a little nurturing. But most of the time, they just simply ignore it and slap it whenever it starts to misbehave or not work the way that they want it to work. Sometimes goblins can be a little bit unpredictable and go, I just milked you, why aren't you producing more venom already? Slap. So it can be a bit cruel and harsh for no fucking reason. And I think that this would be an opportune environment for the Slivers to expand, for Slivers to go along with the, I would say, the masquerade. They are going along with this play, this act of, hey, you know, yeah, let's keep producing you mushrooms off of my back that are crazy magically powerful, and now it's giving me magical power, but you don't realize it because you're a dumbass goblin. Let's go along with this and see what happens. And then, after all the orcs and goblins do migrate, I wouldn't be surprised to see goblins migrating Slivers into places like Iron Rock, into volcanoes, places where are totally desolate. So now you're exposing Slivers to more environments, which means more mutations. Now all of a sudden you have iron Slivers, where they have giant iron talons instead of just normal bone talons. And now they're starting to get magma evolutions. Like now they're completely fire resistant. It's like, oh Jesus. Now you're having Slivers that are spewing out lava. It's like, oh boy. And the orcs and goblins are going to be too stupid to realize, like, hey, we're making our enemy stronger. So it could end up in an issue like that where one day the Sliver hive mind says, all right, we're powerful enough. We've infiltrated their entire society. Kill your masters. And then just wipe out a crap ton of the greenskins. And mind you, they could mutate from the greenskins. Don't let that slip out of your mind. They could totally mutate from the greenskins. What could we steal from the greenskins? Well, every time they fight, they get bigger. Every time they fight, they get stronger. Every time they fight, they get smarter. Imagine if Slivers stole that ability and now applied it to themselves. Now you have orc Slivers where they are getting stronger and bigger and tougher, and they're spreading this to the entire hive. Like, hey guys, keep fighting, because the more and more you fight, the bigger and badder we get. It's like, oh Jesus Christ. So the greenskins royally would fuck up. And I think that they would. They would ultimately fuck up, but it's not their fault. They just don't realize what they're doing. Again, orcs and goblins aren't really that smart. Now, while I do think they could definitely put up a fight with their sheer numbers, and then, you know, black orcs, trolls, arachnarok spiders, I do think they could definitely put up a fight, but I don't think that they would be putting up a fight that they could last in, and that's the key. Could they last in a fight like that? Could they last in a fight against a species that now has crazier magical capabilities than they do, that's now spewing lava at them, that's growing bigger every time they fight, it's mutating wings because it's in a mountainous area so it could fly? Like, could they survive against something like that? Not for long. Not for long at all, especially when the hive mind is much smarter than they are. So, in the end, I think the orcs and goblins would fuck up really, really badly. And in them dying, it could result the end of the world. Because think about it, now you have these Slivers with mushrooms growing on their back that's making them cast energy that's completely unpredictable. All of a sudden a Sliver starts lighting up and you see the mushrooms shaking on his back, and then boom, a giant thunder just fucking strikes the floor. It's like, oh my god, what the hell is that? And then you got other Slivers where it's just gargantuan in size, and he's just a normal Sliver. The reason why he's so big and as tall as a giant is because he survived like 1,000 battles. And besides that, though, he's just a normal Sliver who's an orc Sliver. So it's like, oh my god. Humanity, dwarves, everyone would be fucked if this would be the case. So now let's look at the other scenario. What if the Skaven discovered the Slivers? What if the Skaven had stumbled upon Slivers first and enslaved them or tried to eat them? I think what would happen is the Skaven would realize that, hey, these guys are good test subjects. They're highly mutable, they're highly reproductive, and they seem to be able to resist certain things once they're exposed to it enough. Like if you expose a Sliver to magic, like chaos, they will slowly start to mutate either chaotic traits or they will evolve traits to resist it. It's one or the other. They tend to go both ways. So then it becomes, ooh, Clan Molder. So Clan Molder is going to take over these slivers, and they're going to just experiment like crazy, injecting warp stone into them, doing like head transplants, transplanting a lot of limbs onto them. They're going to try experimenting as much as they possibly can with the slivers. Now, would this be bad? That remains to be seen. The Clan Molder tends to instill fear into their subjects. Now, the problem is that the slivers we don't really see anything in the writings that they feel pain. So that might be an issue. It might be something, as I said before, where the Skaven can drive them towards an enemy. Like the Skaven may develop slivers that are rather large, like a rat ogre, but they have seats on their backs, so that way Skaven packmasters can ride them and guide them towards their enemies and just watch them butcher their foes. I do think that that could happen. That could 100% be the case. But would it be long-lasting is the question. And for that, I say probably not. I think what would most likely happen is that the Skaven would either unlock the sheer mutability that the slivers contain and apply it to themselves, and then, you know, charge other Skaven for the fee of mutation, so that way they can gain certain traits. Or I think what would happen is that the sliver would start to gain immunity to Warpstone, and then in return start to try to revolt against the Skaven, but it would ultimately lead to their demise. Now you may say, why would the sliver die to Skaven? The answer is rather simple. Skaven are more reproductive than orcs and goblins. The Skaven also have deadly weaponry that no other race has. They have machine guns, they have Jeziles, they have guns that are magic and bullets at the same time. They have guns that can rip the fabric of reality. They have weapons and magic that is completely destructive. So destructive it even hurts themselves. But this is not a problem. And then they do have colossal monsters that can deal with certain colossal sizes and forms of the sliver. Now the question becomes, would the Skaven survive in a prolonged war? I think that they could as well. They would even probably start to gain mutagenic benefits. And I think Clan Pestilens in particular would be very useful in a very, very long war in Clan Eshin. But mostly Clan Pestilens, and the reason why is that plague slivers are actually detrimental to the hive. I do have a picture posted up here of a plague sliver, and if you read its description, it does 1 damage to the owner, which means that if it does 1 damage to the owner and it gives it to all the slivers in the hive, that means that the owner is going to die from all the slivers he's created. And I think that that's how Clan Pestilens would win the day against a species like the slivers, that they would invent a disease that would spread rampantly through the sliver hierarchy, and what would happen is that the sliver would end up accidentally passing on this mutation, this disease, this virulence through their entire hive network, and end up killing their overlord, their queen, killing their own eggs. And you could have Clan Eshin go to work too, where they just sneak in and assassinate the queen with whatever bombs or poison daggers that they have. But I think more realistically, in a war of attrition, this would be the way to win the war, would be Clan Pestilens. And I'm not saying this because I like Clan Pestilens. I'm saying this because in MTG, Magic the Gathering, there actually is a Plague Sliver. And I was like, wait a minute, if there's a Plague Sliver, and we have a clan specialized in plagues, I don't think they're going to do well against them. And sure enough, they probably won't. So now let's talk about scenario numero dos, scenario 2. What happens if the sliver were dropped into the world the same time that everyone else was dropped into the world? In other words, what if the slivers existed in the world naturally along with everyone else? I think this would be a much different scenario and a very different outcome in a lot of ways. because what would happen is that the slivers would definitely destroy the Warhammer Fantasy universe. And the reason why I say that is because now the sliver have time on their side. They now have time to mutate against certain species. Like the High Elves and the Dark Elves, for example, are very arrogant in their nature. They're very snobbish. They like to look down on people. They like to look down on other races. Well, if a sliver is dealing with them, it may mutate against the High Elves. It may mutate into a taunting sliver, which I have pictures of as well. Taunting sliver has like this hood like a Cobra King, and it will rattle it in a way that irritates your brain, and just looking at it pisses you the fuck off. Like, it's worse than when you hear a baby cry in Walmart. You just want to come over there and punch the shit out of this thing because of the way the blue hood is irritating the crap out of you. And I think that that would be really effective against some like the dwarves, the high elves, and the dark elves, because it would irritate them to the point that they would step out of line. It would irritate them to the point that they would go, what is this puny inferior thing doing? It's annoying me. Let me put my army out of place, and now we're ambushed. Oh, my bad. Like, that's what I mean by the slivers mutating against certain species and against certain outcomes. And as we talked about the orcs, they could mutate against that, but more importantly, the dwarves. You may have noticed I'm not talking about the dwarves too much. Well, I think if the slivers were dropped in this scenario with the rest of the world, I think it'd be very interesting, because what would happen is that the slivers would find Gromril deposits before the dwarves would, most likely. And what would happen is that now you would have slivers who are exposed to Gromril or exposed to Warpstone before the Skaven or dwarves even discover it. And this could cause a huge amount of issues. Imagine for a second Warpstone slivers. So now they're just cackling energy, and just being around them is causing your DNA to rip apart into shreds. It's almost like being around a bunch of radiation. Or Gromril slivers, which I think is more scary. Slivers that have mutated Gromril skin, Gromril daggers, Gromril teeth, and now they're going to be hard as Gromril. And now they're mutating the entire hive. Think about it. Gromril is the toughest material in the Warhammer universe. If the sliver were dropped in the universe with everyone else, they could potentially mutate into Gromril slivers. And more crazily enough, they could probably destroy chaos. Imagine that. Any magic caster in the Warhammer Fantasy would be completely nullified by a giant hive of Gromril slivers. You try to cast the most deadliest of magics, and it just fizzles away when it's introduced to the horde of slivers. You'll be a chaos champion outfitted with demon swords, demon armor, demon whatever. And the moment these Gromril slivers surround you, your armor and your swords just melt away because it's pure chaos magic energy. And the Gromril slivers just kill you. Easy as that, just done deal. And it's like, well, how do you deal with that? Well, you have artillery, but how are you going to shoot something that's underground? How are you going to shoot something that can just pop up from the sky? How can you shoot something that can just mutate against it? This is what I'm talking about, is that the slivers have infinite value when it comes to the Warhammer universe. And then we can even look at vampire slivers, like what happened in Lamia with the Lamian Sisterhood. What if a sliver was over around Nehekara when the Gash did his sorcery, and now they have undead slivers? And yeah, that actually mutates across the hive. So now all the slivers can rise from the dead after they've been killed. It's like, oh man, that is nasty. Watch out everyone, the slivers are necromancers. Oh shit. And then you have other things like vampire slivers where they gain power based on how many creatures they kill. So now you have these bloodthirsty, hungry as hell Gromril slivers that are after you for your blood. It's like, oh Jesus Christ, this is going to be scary, to say the least. As I said, I find slivers very interesting, and I do find their ideas very unique. Now, there are many species in Warhammer Fantasy. Like, you may have noticed I haven't talked about humanity much, but it's kind of like why I don't talk about humanity much in my Skaven videos. It's because humanity is always on the surface. They don't dwell past that. So things like Skaven, dwarves, night goblins, they're really the main source of problems for something like the Sliver, an underground species. There are other species that we can notably mention, like how would the ogres fare against it? Well, the ogres, while they do have the mass to beat the shit out of a bunch of slivers, a legion of slivers even, and they do have the appetite to keep eating the slivers, I just don't see them surviving long. It's kind of like why the ogres have always been a minor faction in the Warhammer Fantasy setting. They're a minor faction because they just don't last long in a prolonged fight. There's not enough of them numbers-wise to take on huge factions like that. This is why they're better off as mercenaries or better off as neutral and more or less out of the way in the Warhammer scene, because if they start to engage in open conflict, you can see that their numbers start to dwindle very, very fast. Even though there is a lot of them, there is definitely a lot of them, and they are definitely hungry, and they will definitely kill someone for a chance at a snack, they just wouldn't do well against slivers because the slivers would definitely eat away at them. And God forbid if the ogres accidentally mutate the slivers to where the slivers now have a ravenous appetite. Oh dear God. There are some other species like the Tomb Kings, but as I said, with the undead slivers, they would just probably learn it from the Tomb Kings. The vampires, the vampiric slivers. We also have Athalloran, but I think Athalloran's pretty self-explanatory what would happen with the slivers there, because there is a lot of green sliver types. Overgrown slivers, colossal slithers. There's a lot of sliver types that could definitely mutate from the forest of Athalloran that would be very detrimental to the treemen and to the wood elves that live there. In fact, I must say this now, if the slivers existed at the same time as everyone else and they existed in Athalloran with the treemen, I think the treemen would actually prefer the slivers and work together with the slivers and not allow high elves inside their forest. So there wouldn't even be a wood elf faction because the slivers are much better at that, protecting the forest, than the wood elves would be. And also, you know, slivers, they kind of act animalistic. So in other words, the treemen might not even view them as like a sentient species, and as long as the treemen don't really behave in a certain way, the slivers will just leave them alone. They just look like trees after all. So why would a sliver waste his time attacking it? It's something like that that I think is very key in pointing out with certain factions. The lizardmen, for example, I think the lizardmen would definitely suck and would definitely get their shit pounded in by an army of slivers. The question would be, is would the slivers mutate in a way of being larger, like a Croxigore, or would they mutate in other ways, like maybe gaining barbs? So now every time that you attack them, they're like a porcupine and they just stab the shit out of you. Stuff like that when it comes to the lizardmen jungles I could find very interesting. But it's mostly the Warhammer Old World I'm more focused on, because that's where most of the action lies. So if you guys enjoyed this assessment, please comment down below. Again, a second comment. I would love to see if you commented twice, you know, one from the first thing that I told you to comment and one for now. And just tell me down below if you guys think I'm right. You guys could just be completely disagreeing with me and go, Chaos Dwarves would beat their shit in, hoorah! Or it could be something like, nah, the dwarves would not stand seeing such a species like this. Kazakuk Kazahi ha! And it's like, you know, that's great. Tell me down below. Besides that, see you guys next time.